Thanks for sticking with us. We're going to have now an extended discussion of a couple of paintings that we found really relevant to this week's episode. We'll start by talking about Albrecht Altdorfer's 1529 painting, The Battle of Alexander at Issus, and then briefly touch on a painting of a volcano by American artist Frederic Church.
This actually has a really interesting manuscript precedent too. There's like a small version of it that appears in this triumphal procession manuscript from the early 16th century that was commissioned by Maximilian I. And it's so different from Altdorfer's other kind of landscapes because it's this moment of conflict and kind of cosmic cataclysm, where so much of his other work is this kind of contemplative Christian scenes in nature, but its size, I think, is so notable because it allows him to be so detailed. Sophia, as you were saying, that like horse armor is like crystal clear, and there are so many interesting details that you can pick out about it, but it is quite a departure from his earlier work, in that it sort of presents you the opposite almost, but you get this really interesting play of size because the painting itself is so huge, but then the details are so small and so intricate. But it presents this like moment of extreme kind of, cosmic cataclysm, even though it's a particular historical battle, right? But it feels so much more apocalyptic in its presentation.
Yeah, and I mean, the theme that I also love in a painting like this is the way that they contemporize a historic event. So they take an event from classical antiquity and they make it relevant in the present moment. So Alexander's defeat of Darius, and then you have the current battle between European monarchies and the Ottomans. That feels relevant in the same way we're seeing the kind of urgencies of races and kingdoms going to war over Middle Earth.
I think, I mean, it's cool too that it's really separated between the kind of landscape at the top, which has this sort of vast scale that you see very far into the background, and the kind of swirling clouds, and the sort of discomfort with which the inscription is sort of floating in the middle of the sky, which gives it this kind of almost biblical, kind of almost foreseen or inevitable kind of feeling that this is something that can be captioned with an inscription that feels like it's part of the scene. And then the whole lower half given over to this kind of mess of armor and horses and heraldry and flags and the kind of chaos of a battle scene. But the whole painting itself feels so composed and kind of so winding that you have the kind of echo of the riverscape in the background kind of echoed in the movement of the troops. It feels sort of like they're mirroring each other too. And you have this really kind of balanced composition, which feels so harmonious in a way, even though the topic of the painting is kind of chaotic and unsettling.
I also rather enjoy that this is both a historical event, and a landscape painting all together. And so, as you said, Larissa, the landscape up at the top, but then it even becomes almost like a pattern of landscape at the bottom of the painting itself. And the painting, as Larissa said, is rather large. It's over 5 feet tall. So you can imagine coming up to it and seeing the horse armor in detail there. It's interesting to me that to pick out the protagonists or the subjects in the scene, it's very difficult. And so you have to kind of like rove around it and see where they are. You finally alight on the chariot on the left side, bottom side there.
I certainly don't want to make too much out of this, but I think one of the reasons that this painting came to mind for a number of us watching this episode is just the details that ring Tolkien bells in our heads, even beyond this episode. I mean, we have this very powerful, very populated battle scene in the foreground. You have the middle ground that's dominated by this mountain, and that's an obvious visual connection to Mount Doom. I mean, looking at it now in detail, it's like, it looks like there's kind of an island realm there in the middle, which reminds me of Numenor. And then to the left in the middle ground, there's this dark, craggy formation that's jutting up outside of, out of the ground. And I'm like, that rings a bell with Isengard in my head, even though it's a completely, distinct from the era that we're looking at in this episode. But I think it's worth also drawing attention to the fact that, this is a painting from the 16th century, which in terms of art historical or historical classification, we're kind of entering into the early modern period at this point. And something that I've been kind of mulling over as I've been thinking about the genesis or development of modern fantasy and modern fantasy imagery, I feel like there's an extent to which we might be able to say that modern fantasy imagery is contingent on the kind of not advances, but developments in naturalistic representation that come out of the Renaissance. And it's something that makes it, uniquely distinct from actual medieval imagery that is very informative to a lot of fantasy medievalizing imagery. And to put it another way, as my colleagues have been saying here, it's a very rich, very detailed landscape, very detailed painting that includes landscape elements, that includes architectural elements, that includes human elements, armor, all these things that are so richly detailed throughout the entirety of the painting. It almost is kind of a 16th century secondary world. It's this, very, very built out kind of representation of an imagined kind of battle scene that, as Brian said, is both based in real events, but is also historically anachronistic in other ways.
Sarah, I think that's such an interesting point because I think it really speaks to the kind of layered visual language that fantasy is using, that we often associate fantasy with the Middle Ages, but really contemporary fantasy freely draws on so many different art historical periods and art historical precedents. I think it's fascinating that we can look at the 16th century painting, which itself is coming out of manuscript illumination of the later 15th century, and Altdorfer is looking specifically at Albrecht Dürer and his other sort of German, I'll call them Renaissance contemporaries, but things like Grunewald's Eisenheim altarpiece, which have such a kind of contemporary feel to them too. They feel modern and kind of prescient in a way. But I wonder if that's because we've seen it in fantasy and we sort of want to read those things back into historical art. So I think it's fascinating that we can look at a piece like this and pull out, or we can be so reminded of these kind of narrative elements of Lord of the Rings and kind of read that into the painting, which like 16th century viewers, of course, would never have associated it with fiction or fantasy really at all. But I do love that kind of, if you can think of a 16th century viewer looking at this painting and bringing their knowledge of antiquity, their knowledge of the classical past, and the way that it's kind of been recast in terms of Northern European visual traditions, that it is a form of fantasy for them too, and to kind of see these things overlapping in so many really interesting ways that bring the past and our contemporary present and fantasy and the Middle Ages all together in this kind of like weird soup. And I love that kind of idea of the Rings of Power kind of drawing so heavily on these historical precedents without maybe even knowing it. And for us to be able to read that back in is just really fun.
I was wondering if we could say a little more too about these stepping stones, because Sarah, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about your background painting as well. I mean, we've already seen Larissa's great Thomas Cole picture from the early 1800s, but then we have yours from a few decades later by Frederic Church, right? I mean, this is this great volcano in Ecuador. And I know in thinking about the episode that we just watched, the showrunners and directors were thinking about historic volcanic eruptions. And we have great examples. Everyone thinks of Pompeii. There were a number of volcanic eruptions in the Middle Ages that darkened the sky from El Salvador to Indonesia, but then you have this really fantastic picture that is coming out of that longer tradition of history paintings in the 16th century and then grand landscape paintings, series paintings and allegories. So I wonder if you could walk us through that picture, because it is so evocative of what we just witnessed in the Southlands.
Yeah, and I'll say right off the bat, I am not an expert in the work of Church, and the main reason I was thinking about his work was we were talking in my class on fantasy, modern fantasy art today about some of Tolkien's illustrators, and we read a text by Ted Naismith, who's one of the most well-known of his illustrators, and Naismith specifically cites Church as a big point of reference, and that kind of tradition of landscape representation, particularly in 19th century America, this kind of golden age of American landscape. And as you say, this is a volcano in Ecuador, and it's one that Church visited. Church was very intent on going and visiting sites that he would represent, taking, kind of firsthand sketches and things, and trying to then merge them into a very naturalistic, often panoramic, monumental kind of representation. One we looked at in my class today was his Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about the statement about Church and Naismith in bringing up Church was talking about kind of how he was moving away from the more familiar areas of mid 20th century art, kind of when he was coming up as an artist, and how he appreciated the realism of someone like Church's art. And that really struck me, considering how we're seeing these kinds of trends continue with the Rings of Power. It's not just that it's cinema and it's real people acting within these contexts, but kind of ties back to something Larissa brought up in one of our early conversations about the traditions of illustration and these kind of hyper realistic, very slick kinds of approaches that we see manifest in the CGI. And that it was interesting for me to hear Naismith, who isn't always hyper naturalistic, but that's clearly something that he is keen on in a lot of his illustrative work, how he's drawing back to someone like Church, who obviously has this style that we associate with realism. But once again, and as I was at pains to emphasize to my students, recourse to realism as a signifier of authenticity or reality is not always to be taken as evident or as given. And a lot of times this kind of effort at realism can mask a lot of misconceptions, a lot of dark things, racism, things like that aren't immediately apparent on the surface.